They say exorcisms belong in movies, dramatic, dark, and designed to frighten. But what if I told you that in 1788, 7 respected clergymen of the Church of England gathered not for show, but for witness, and signed their names to an account so unsettling, it was quietly buried for over a century. This wasn't folklore. It wasn't rumor. It was ink on parchment, and it described a man who barked like a dog, sang in unknown tongues, and claimed voices inside him spoke with the authority of something far older than man. Welcome to the Conjuring Files, where we go beyond Hollywood horror to uncover real, documented cases that blur the line between history, belief, and the unexplained. I'm your guide, and this is Conjuring Files number 032. Today, we're opening a sealed ledger from 18th century England, a case so rare, it defies easy explanation. Not because it proves demons exist, but because it proves that rational men, trained in theology and reason, were left without answers. The story begins in a quiet town with a man named George Lukins, a tailor by trade, unremarkable by all accounts. But after a fall from a scaffold, something changed. Neighbors reported hearing him howl at night, not in pain, but in patterns. He'd sing hymns backward, speak in voices that shifted from childlike to guttural. And when 7 local clergymen visited him together, they didn't perform an exorcism. They observed, they questioned, and then, in an act almost unheard of, they all signed a single document confirming what they'd witnessed. Now, skeptics rightly point to possible causes: epilepsy, dissociative identity disorder, even mass suggestion. And in today's light, those explanations carry weight. But what's harder to dismiss is the unanimity of the account. These weren't fringe mystics. They were educated men of the established church, men who had every reason to deny the extraordinary, yet chose to record it. Their ledger didn't claim victory over evil. It didn't describe rituals or holy water. It simply stated, he spoke in 7 voices. We heard them. We attest to this. And then silence. The document vanished into private hands, resurfacing only decades later in a London newspaper, sparking debate, then fading again. So why revisit it now? Because this case forces us to ask, when rational people document the irrational, what do we do with their testimony? Do we dismiss it, medicalize it, or do we sit with the discomfort of not knowing? Because the truth is, some files were never meant to be solved, only preserved. Next, the witness accounts that turned a local oddity into a national mystery.
At first, people thought George Lukins was just broken, a man shaken by injury, lost in grief or madness. But then the neighbors started talking, not in hushed tones at church, but in written letters, diary entries, even court affidavits. And their stories were too consistent to ignore. One shopkeeper wrote, "He stood in the square at dusk, singing a hymn, but the words were wrong, and his voice kept changing, like several men speaking through one throat." A midwife claimed she heard him barking through the walls of his lodgings, not like a dog in anger, but like a thing mimicking speech. And a young apprentice swore he saw Lukins laugh in a voice so deep it made the windows rattle, then immediately weep in a child's tone, begging to be let out. What made these accounts so troubling wasn't just their strangeness, it was their sobriety. These weren't superstitious villagers. They were tradespeople, clerks, women of standing. And they weren't calling for fire or exorcism. They were asking, what is happening to this man? The turning point came when Lukins was brought before local magistrates, not for blasphemy, but because his outbursts disturbed the peace. During the hearing, he reportedly fell silent until a clergyman in the room quoted scripture. Then, without warning, Lukins erupted, not in anger, but in a chorus of voices, one singing a Latin chant, another barking in rhythm, a third screaming in a language no one recognized. The room emptied in minutes. But the magistrate? He stayed, and he wrote it all down. That testimony eventually reached the 7 clergymen who would later sign the famous account. They didn't come as hunters of demons. They came as men of reason, trained in logic, theology, and human nature. Yet after hours of observation, they concluded something had taken root in Lukins that defied medical or psychological explanation of their time. Critics today argue this was early documentation of severe mental illness, perhaps trauma-induced dissociation or temporal lobe epilepsy. And that may well be true. But here's what even skeptics struggle with. Why did all witnesses, regardless of education, gender, or belief, describe the same pattern? The barking, the singing, the sudden shifts in voice and demeanor, the aversion to sacred texts. It wasn't one person's nightmare. It was a chorus of witnesses, all singing the same strange tune. And that collective unease is what turned a local oddity into something far more enduring. A case so baffling, it forced men of faith to put their names to the unknown. Next, the secret meeting of 7 clergymen and the signed document that refused to stay buried.
Exorcis armisti omnis immundus spiritus, in nome patris.
Get out! Leave me be!
They didn't arrive with holy water or chanting. No crosses, no Latin incantations, no dramatic rituals. When the 7 clergymen entered the room in 1788, they came as investigators, not exorcists. Each was a respected figure in the Church of England: rectors, vicars, scholars trained in logic and scripture. And they had one goal: to determine whether George Lukins was mad or something far less explainable. What happened next wasn't performed for an audience. There were no spectators, no journalists, no dramatic lighting. Just 7 men, a flickering candle, and a man who sat quietly until they began to read from the Book of Psalms. Then, witnesses reported Lukins' body stiffened. His voice fractured. One moment, he was silent. The next, a guttural bark echoed from his throat, followed instantly by a child's soprano singing a hymn backward. Then a third voice, deep and resonant, declared in perfect Latin, "You have no power here." They questioned him, not to command, but to understand, and the responses defied coherence. When asked his name, he gave 7 different answers, in 7 distinct tones. When shown a Bible, he recoiled as if burned. Yet when left alone, he'd sit peacefully, even weeping softly, as if unaware of what had just occurred. For hours, they observed. They took notes. And when it was over, they did something unprecedented. They all signed a single document affirming what they'd witnessed, not as believers in demons, but as men who could no longer explain what they'd seen through reason alone. That document didn't claim to banish evil. It didn't boast of victory. It simply stated, "We, the undersigned, attest that George Lukins exhibited utterances and behaviors inconsistent with any known human faculty, and that these manifestations ceased only when sacred text was read aloud in his presence." For decades, the ledger vanished, passed between private hands, whispered about in theological circles, but never published. It resurfaced only in 1870, when a London newspaper printed excerpts, igniting fierce debate. Scholars called it a hoax. Clergy called it a warning. Doctors called it a tragic case of untreated illness. But the document endured, not because it proved the supernatural, but because it captured a moment when faith, reason, and mystery collided, and even the most rational men chose to sign their names to the unknown. And that signed page, fragile, ink-blotted, centuries old, remains one of the few cases in English history where the Church itself documented an anomaly it could not resolve. Next, what happened after that night? Why was the case sealed away, and what warnings were left behind?
Thank the Lord.
After that night in 1788, George Lukins didn't vanish into legend. He didn't become a cautionary tale shouted from pulpits. Instead, he faded into quiet obscurity, cared for by a local family who refused to speak of him, even in private letters. But the document? That refused to die. Within weeks of the clergyman's signed account, church authorities quietly advised that the matter be laid to rest. Not because it was false, but because it was too volatile. In an age of enlightenment, where reason was rising and superstition was being dismantled, a case like this threatened both sides. It unsettled the rationalists, and it terrified the faithful. So the ledger was sealed first in a parish chest, then in a private library, then in the hands of a collector who added a single note to its cover: "Do not open without counsel." Why the warning? Not because the paper was cursed, but because of what it represented. This wasn't a ghost story. It was a crack in the foundation of certainty. If 7 educated men could witness something they couldn't explain, what did that mean for the rest of us? Over the years, fragments of the case leaked out. A theologian referenced it in a footnote. A doctor cited it as evidence of hysterical mimicry. But the full account remained hidden until 1870, when a journalist obtained a copy and published it in the Daily Telegraph. Overnight, Lukins became a sensation. Spiritualists claimed him as proof of demonic reality. Scientists dismissed him as epileptic theater. And the Church of England? It issued no statement. It simply said nothing. But those closest to the original event left quieter traces. In margins of personal journals, in sealed letters to family, in the notes of a vicar's final sermon, there are echoes of unease. One wrote, "I have seen madness. I have seen deceit." But what we saw that night was neither. It was something that watched us back. Another simply crossed out an entire page, writing beneath it, "Some doors, once opened, cannot be closed by human hands." The truth is, they weren't afraid of Lukins. They were afraid of what his case implied, that the world was less orderly than they'd believed, that some disturbances couldn't be cured, exorcised, or explained away. And that sometimes, the most responsible act wasn't to speak, but to seal the file. Which raises a final question. If this case was meant to stay buried, why are we uncovering it now? Next, the legacy of the Lukins file, and why this 236-year-old mystery still haunts historians, theologians, and skeptics alike.
So why does the George Lukins case still matter, 236 years later? Because it lives in the gray space between belief and evidence, between what we can explain and what we must simply witness. Modern psychology offers compelling possibilities: complex PTSD, dissociative identity disorder, or even a rare neurological condition triggered by trauma. Historians note that Lukins lived in an era when mental illness was poorly understood and often interpreted through a spiritual lens. And yet, even with all our science, we can't fully recreate the consistency of those reports. The barking, the singing, the 7 voices, the aversion to scripture, the unanimous testimony of rational men. That's the real power of this file. It doesn't prove demons exist, but it does prove that some experiences defy easy categorization, even for those who desperately want to believe in order. Today, the original 1788 ledger is believed to be held in a private archive in southern England. It's never been digitized, never been authenticated by mainstream academia. And perhaps that's fitting, because this case was never meant to be a weapon for either side of the debate. It wasn't proof for the faithful or folly for the skeptics. It was simply a record, a quiet admission that sometimes the world is stranger than our frameworks allow. And that's where the Conjuring Files comes in. We don't chase ghosts to scare you. We uncover records to challenge you, to ask better questions, to hold space for mystery without surrendering to fear, and to honor the complexity of human experience across centuries. Because the goal isn't to confirm the supernatural. It's to understand why stories like Lukins endure, and what they reveal about our deepest hopes, fears, and limits of knowledge. So if this deep dive into one of England's most enigmatic historical anomalies unsettled you, intrigued you, or made you rethink what possession really meant in 1788, do us a favor. Like this video, subscribe to the Conjuring Files, and share it with someone who values mystery grounded in real history. Every episode is crafted to explore the edge of the unknown, responsibly, thoughtfully, and without sensationalism. And remember, the truth is in the files.